1944, a 14-year-old girl was living in a partially collapsed apartment building. Limited food. No reliable heat. Unsafe sanitation. She used a metal container as a toilet because the stairwell had collapsed. This is how it unfolded. The winter of 1944 descended upon the outskirts of Naples with persistent rains that turned the rubble-strewn streets into channels of mud and standing water. The residential quarter on the city's northern edge had been heavily damaged during the fighting and bombardment of the previous year, leaving rows of apartment buildings in various states of collapse. Some structures had lost entire facades, their interior rooms exposed like cells in a honeycomb. Others stood with walls intact but roofs caved in, skeletal frames of rafters jutting against the gray sky. The air carried the smell of damp plaster, mildew, and the faint odor of sewage from broken pipes that had never been repaired. Smoke rose from scattered locations where residents burned whatever they could find for warmth, thin columns that dissolved quickly into the low clouds that seemed to press down on the damaged landscape. Lucia Ferraro was 14 years old and lived with her widowed mother in a third-floor apartment of a building that had suffered partial collapse during an air raid the previous autumn. The explosion had brought down the eastern section of the structure, leaving a jagged edge of broken walls and exposed reinforcement bars. The apartment where Lucia and her mother now lived consisted of a single room that had once been a kitchen, the only space in their original unit that remained structurally sound. They had sealed the doorway leading to the ruined portions with boards scavenged from the debris below, wedging planks into the frame and stuffing gaps with strips of fabric and newspaper. The room measured roughly 10 feet by 12, with a single window that had lost its glass and been covered with oiled cloth stretched across a wooden frame. The floor was tiled in a pattern that had once been decorative but was now cracked and stained. A small cast-iron stove sat in one corner, vented through a pipe that led out through a hole knocked in the exterior wall. The stove burned rarely, as fuel was almost impossible to obtain. Lucia's father had been killed during the bombardment, crushed beneath falling masonry while attempting to reach a shelter. Her mother had survived but had been left with injuries to her back and legs that limited her ability to work. She took in mending when she could find it, sitting for hours in the dim light repairing clothes for neighbors in exchange for food or small amounts of money. Lucia herself had become the primary support for their household, navigating the systems of relief distribution and informal trade that sustained the civilian population in the occupied city. The day began before dawn, as Lucia woke on the straw mattress she shared with her mother, both of them sleeping fully clothed beneath wool blankets and the coats they wore during the day. The room was cold enough that their breath formed clouds in the darkness. Lucia rose carefully, trying not to disturb her mother, and pulled on an additional layer, a sweater with unraveling cuffs that she tucked into the waistband of her skirt. Her shoes were leather ankle boots that had belonged to someone else, obtained through trade, their soles worn thin and their laces replaced with cord. She wrapped a scarf around her head and shoulders, then moved to the corner where they kept a metal container that served as a nighttime toilet. The building's plumbing had ceased functioning months earlier, and the shared latrines in the courtyard below were accessible only during daylight hours when it was safe to navigate the damaged stairwells. She emptied the container out the window into the courtyard below, a practice common throughout the building and one that contributed to the persistent smell of waste that hung over the area. She then prepared for the morning's first task, which was to join the line at the relief distribution point operated by American military authorities 3 blocks away. The distribution occurred twice weekly, providing bread and occasionally tinned goods to residents who could present identification papers proving residence in the designated zone. Lucia had learned to arrive early, as the lines grew long and supplies sometimes ran out before everyone could be served. The walk to the distribution point required descending the building's main stairwell, a structure that had been damaged in the same attack that destroyed their apartment. Several steps were missing, replaced by boards that residents had laid across the gaps. The railing on one side had been torn away, leaving an open edge that dropped 3 floors to the ground. Lucia moved carefully, staying close to the wall, her hand trailing along the plaster as she descended. The stairwell was dark, its windows either boarded or blocked by debris, and she navigated largely by memory and the faint light that entered from above. The street outside was quiet at this hour, the only movement coming from others heading to the same distribution point or to work details organized by the occupation authorities. Lucia walked along the edge of the road, avoiding the deeper puddles and the worst of the mud. Buildings on either side showed varying degrees of damage, some inhabited, others abandoned and stripped of anything useful. She passed the church that had lost its roof, its interior open to the sky, and a row of shops whose fronts had been blown out, their interiors empty except for debris. The distribution point was located in a former school building that had been requisitioned by the military. A line had already formed when Lucia arrived, perhaps 30 people standing in the cold rain, their heads covered with shawls or newspapers. She took her place at the end and waited, her hands tucked into her armpits for warmth. The line moved slowly as each person presented papers and received their allocation. When Lucia reached the front, she showed the identification card her mother had been issued, and a soldier handed her a portion of bread wrapped in paper and a small tin of preserved meat. The bread was dense and grayish, made from flour that included various adulterants, but it was filling and could be made to last for days if rationed carefully. She returned to the apartment, climbing the damaged stairs with the food tucked inside her coat. Her mother was awake, sitting on the edge of the mattress and coughing, a deep wet sound that had persisted for weeks. Lucia divided the bread into portions, setting aside most of it and cutting a small piece for their immediate meal. They ate in silence, chewing slowly, and afterward Lucia wrapped the remaining bread in cloth and placed it in a wooden crate they used for storage. The tin of meat she saved for later, understanding that such items could be traded for other necessities. The rest of the morning was occupied with tasks that maintained their minimal existence. Lucia descended to the courtyard to draw water from a communal pump that still functioned, filling a metal bucket and carrying it back up the stairs. The water was used sparingly, for drinking and for the small amounts of washing they could manage. Bathing was infrequent, conducted with water heated in a pot over the stove when fuel could be found, and Lucia had developed skin rashes from the combination of poor hygiene and the lice that infested their bedding and clothing. Her mother had cut Lucia's hair short with a pair of sewing scissors, a measure meant to reduce the lice infestation, and the result made her look younger and more severe. Food beyond the relief rations came through barter and occasional charity. Lucia had traded items from their former life, things salvaged from the ruined rooms of their apartment, a decorative bowl, a pair of candlesticks, a wool blanket. These were exchanged with neighbors or at informal markets for vegetables, olive oil, or salt. A church 2 streets away operated a kitchen that served soup on certain days, and Lucia went when the schedule allowed, standing in another line to receive a ladleful of thin broth poured into a container she brought from home. The rhythm of these activities filled the daylight hours. Lucia moved between the apartment and various points in the neighborhood, collecting water, seeking food, checking on neighbors who were elderly or ill, and sometimes running errands for them in exchange for small payments. Her mother remained in the room, sewing when her hands were steady enough, resting when they were not. The cough worsened as the weather grew colder and wetter, and Lucia noticed that her mother ate less, pushing her portions back toward Lucia when she thought her daughter was not watching. As winter deepened, the conditions throughout the building deteriorated. The damaged structure continued to weaken under the assault of rain and wind. Water leaked through gaps in the roof and ran down interior walls, causing plaster to soften and fall away in chunks. The wooden stairs grew slick with moisture, and sections that had been merely cracked began to sag under the weight of residents passing over them. The population of the building had thinned, some families having left for other accommodations or having been relocated by authorities, but those who remained had nowhere else to go. The food situation worsened as well. The relief distributions became less regular, and the portions shrank. Lines grew longer as more people sought access to the limited supplies. Lucia found herself waiting for hours in the cold rain only to receive half a loaf instead of a full portion, or to be turned away when supplies ran out before she reached the front. The informal markets where she had traded items became less active as everyone's reserves of tradable goods diminished. Prices for vegetables and other foodstuffs rose beyond what could be paid, and Lucia began to see signs of real hunger among the children in the neighborhood, their faces growing gaunt and their movements slow. The collapse occurred on a morning in late January during a period of particularly heavy rain that had lasted for 3 days without break. Lucia was in the apartment with her mother when they heard a deep groaning sound from the stairwell, followed by a crash that shook the walls. The noise brought residents out of their rooms, and Lucia joined others in the hallway looking toward the source of the sound. A section of the stairwell between the second and third floors had given way, the supporting structure beneath it having rotted through from water damage. The gap created was roughly 8 feet wide, a jagged opening that exposed the stairwell below and left the upper floors cut off from ground-level access. Residents on the third and fourth floors gathered at the edge of the gap, looking down at the debris that had fallen to the landing below. Someone shouted down to those on the lower floors, and voices called back and forth as people assessed the situation. The immediate concern was access to water and to the courtyard latrines. The pump and the sanitation facilities were both on the ground floor, now unreachable except by a dangerous climb down the exterior of the building or through adjacent structures. A group of men attempted to construct a temporary bridge using planks and ladders scavenged from various sources, but the gap was too wide and the materials too weak. The structure they built sagged dangerously when weight was placed on it, and the attempt was abandoned. An alternative emerged when someone suggested using ropes to lower buckets to the ground level, allowing water to be drawn and pulled up. Ropes were found and tied together, and a system was established where residents on the lower floors filled buckets at the pump and attached them to the rope, which was then hauled up by those above. This arrangement functioned but was slow and required coordination between multiple people. Lucia took part in the effort, helping to pull the rope and transfer water from the bucket into containers that residents brought to a collection point in the hallway. The work was tiring, and the amount of water that could be brought up was limited. Rationing became necessary, with each household receiving a smaller allocation than they had previously drawn directly from the pump. The situation with the latrines was more difficult to resolve. Without access to the courtyard facilities, residents on the upper floors were forced to use containers in their rooms, as Lucia and her mother had been doing at night, but now during the day as well. The smell in the hallways intensified, and the health risks grew as waste accumulated. Some residents began disposing of waste through windows, adding to the already unsanitary conditions in the courtyard below. Days passed without any official response to the building's crisis. The occupation authorities were dealing with similar problems throughout the damaged areas of the city, and had limited resources to address structural failures in residential buildings. The residents organized themselves as best they could, sharing the burden of water collection and attempting to maintain some level of sanitation. Lucia found herself spending hours each day involved in these collective efforts, pulling ropes, distributing water, and helping elderly neighbors who could not manage the new system. Her mother's condition worsened during this period. The increased dampness in the building and the stress of the changed circumstances aggravated her cough, and she spent much of her time lying on the mattress, wrapped in blankets and struggling to breathe. Lucia tried to keep the room as dry as possible, wiping water from the walls and ceiling and repositioning their belongings to avoid the worst of the leaks, but the moisture was pervasive. She used a portion of their dwindling food reserves to trade for medicine from a neighbor who had connections to a black market pharmacy, but the pills she obtained seemed to have little effect. The winter continued with no improvement in conditions. The relief distributions became even more irregular, and Lucia sometimes returned from waiting in line with nothing. The church kitchen closed for a period when their supply of ingredients ran out, leaving one fewer source of food. Lucia's own health began to decline, her energy diminished by inadequate nutrition and the constant physical demands of maintaining their existence. She noticed that her clothes hung looser and that climbing the stairs left her breathless and dizzy. It was during this period that the nature of Lucia's daily life shifted from routine survival to something more desperate. The tasks that had once been difficult but manageable became overwhelming. The distance to the distribution point seemed longer, the stairs more treacherous, the weight of the water bucket impossible to lift. She moved more slowly, resting frequently, and found herself sitting in the hallway or on the stairs for long periods, unable to summon the energy to continue. The world contracted to the immediate concerns of the next meal, the next bucket of water, the next hour of endurance. The collapse of the stairwell had cut the building's residents off from more than just physical access to the ground floor. It had severed connections to the broader systems of aid and community that had made survival possible. Isolated on the upper floors, dependent on improvised solutions and dwindling resources, the residents faced a situation that grew more dire with each passing day. Lucia understood this in a way that was not articulated but felt, a knowledge that came from watching her mother grow weaker and from feeling her own strength fade, from the thinning faces of the children she saw in the hallways and the increasing silence as people withdrew into their rooms and stopped engaging with one another. The war continued beyond their immediate circumstances, its progress marked by distant sounds of artillery, and the occasional passage of military convoys along the main roads. These events had little direct bearing on Lucia's existence, which had narrowed to the confines of a damaged building and the struggle to maintain life within it. The larger narrative of campaigns and strategies and political changes was irrelevant when set against the immediate reality of hunger and cold and the slow failure of the body under sustained deprivation. Lucia's mother died in early February, her body finally unable to sustain itself against the combined assault of illness, malnutrition, and exposure. Lucia found her one morning, cold and still on the mattress they had shared, her face peaceful in a way it had not been during the final weeks of labored breathing. Lucia sat beside the body for a long time, not moving, not thinking, simply present with the fact of death that had been approaching for so long and had finally arrived. Neighbors helped remove the body, carrying it down through the damaged building using ropes and makeshift stretchers, a process that took hours and required the cooperation of residents on multiple floors. Lucia's mother was buried in a mass grave in a cemetery on the city's outskirts, one among hundreds who had died that winter from similar causes. Lucia attended the burial, standing in the rain among strangers as a priest spoke words she did not hear, and then returned to the empty room that was now hers alone. She continued to live in the building through the remainder of the winter and into spring, sustained by the relief distributions that gradually became more regular as supply lines improved and by the charity of neighbors who included her in their own meager meals. When the weather warmed and conditions stabilized, she was placed by a relief organization in a group home for orphaned and displaced children, a facility operated by nuns in a convent that had survived the fighting largely intact. Lucia remained in the group home for 2 years, receiving basic education and training in domestic skills. She worked in the convent's kitchen and laundry, tasks that provided structure and purpose. At 16, she was apprenticed to a seamstress, learning a trade that would support her through young adulthood. She worked steadily, living in a small rented room and saving what money she could. She married at 22 to a man who had served in the military and returned to Naples after the war, and they had 4 children. The family lived in an apartment in a building constructed during the post-war reconstruction, a structure with solid walls and functioning plumbing and stairs that did not collapse. Lucia rarely spoke about the winter of 1944, offering only brief acknowledgments when her children asked about her childhood. The memories remained present in ways that shaped her daily habits, her insistence on maintaining stocks of food beyond immediate need, her discomfort with waste, her careful attention to the structural integrity of buildings and her reluctance to live above the ground floor. She kept their apartment meticulously clean and ensured that her children were always adequately clothed and fed, standards that sometimes seemed excessive to those around her but which made perfect sense against the baseline of deprivation she had known. She worked part-time as a seamstress throughout her adult life, eventually opening a small shop where she employed other women and trained apprentices. She approached the work with precision and reliability, building a reputation that sustained the business through changing economic conditions. She retired in her 60s and spent her remaining years helping to raise her grandchildren and volunteering at a charity that provided meals to the poor. When Lucia died in 2006 at the age of 76, her children found among her possessions a small metal container that had been carefully preserved, cleaned and polished but clearly very old. They recognized it as having sat on a shelf in her apartment for as long as they could remember, though she had never explained its significance. It had been the container used as a nighttime toilet in that cold room during the winter when she was 14, kept not as a relic of suffering but as a reminder of the distance traveled, a measure of how far removed her children and grandchildren were from circumstances that had once seemed inescapable. The object held no meaning for them beyond its mystery, and it was eventually discarded during the clearing of her apartment, its history lost with the woman who had carried it forward through decades of ordinary life built on foundations laid in extraordinary hardship.